Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. This is alexsachon, and today we're going to be continuing our series on the secret history of the 20th century. And so this will be part 5 of a multi-part series that's going to extend into the future. But the title of this present article that I'm basing this episode around, which is again part 5, it's called The Classified Science of Nikola Tesla. And this is a rather epic article. It might be my longest of my overall book project that I've been doing over the past year plus. It's around 40 pages on my Word document. But I thought that it was necessary to make it this comprehensive and this long in order to cover all the key material that I wanted to cover in this section. So in this article, we're going to be talking not just about Nikola Tesla, but we're also going to be setting the stage by looking at a few other relevant events that were taking place around his time period. And overall, we're going to be arguing that the version of physics and science that Nikola Tesla was working with, and that others in the late 19th century were also working with, how this paradigm of science sort of disappeared soon after Tesla's time. And I argue that it disappeared because it went classified. And so that's what I mean by the classified science of Nikola Tesla. So this is an idea that I'm going to be explaining in depth over the course of this article. And also important and significant about this article is that in the lead-off section or the intro, I'm going to be laying out the methodology that I'm going to be using and I have been using so far to lay out this sort of revisionist history of the 20th century. So normally when you're presenting a theory, you would lay out your methodology in the beginning, but for sort of artistic reasons, I decided to wait until this article to introduce the concept. And when I do so, maybe you'll understand why I waited to this point. But anyway, because there's so much material in this article, I don't want to spend too much time talking or doing commentary. I want to get into the substance of what we're going to be discussing. And so I want to jump right in. So this initial section is called Reframing the 20th Century. And I'm going to, as I mentioned before, I'm going to be laying out the methodology that I have been using and will continue to use to lay out my thesis about what the actual history of the 20th century represents and what actually transpired in this pivotal point in time. So let's jump into it. Once again, this first section is called Reframing the 20th Century, and we're going to be jumping into that right now. Okay, so this first section, once again, it's called Reframing the 20th Century, and let's get into it. In 2010, I enrolled in a graduate program at George Washington University to study the social science of organizational management, a program called Organizational Science. In the first class of the master's program, we used a textbook written by 2 experienced management consultants called Reframing Organizations. This was by Bowman and Deal. The main message of the textbook was that as a consultant, you need to be able to hold different perspectives about what organizations are, how they work, and what their priorities and goals should be. The goal for the consultant is to be able to layer different ideas and perspectives about what organizations are and how they function, how they should be managed, to layer these together and synthesize them. To give an example of this mode of thinking at work, consider how, on one level, an organization is a network of well-defined, specialized roles, tasks, and relationships. Therefore, a consultant needs to be able to look at the organization on this impersonal structural level, like what is depicted in a typical organizational map. On another level, however, organizations are political arenas where conflicting viewpoints, visions, and personalities compete and vie for influence. And so a good consultant must be able to approach the organization on this more personal and emotional level. Then, on a human resources level, organizations are platforms where individuals pursue personal goals and career ambitions. And so a well-managed organization must also be able to engage with its employees on this more individualized, sort of career-centric, intimate level. So no one of those 3 frames I discussed is the definitive single view of an organization. Rather, all of them are legitimate, and so a consultant needs to be able to consider and synthesize all 3 and also additional perspectives together. That's at least the argument that this textbook was making. So overall, what we find here is an approach that seeks to layer different frames or perspectives about what an organization is, how it works, how it competes in its environment, and how it interacts with its employees and stakeholders. The goal for the organizational scientist is to be able to synthesize these views together, with management decisions being informed by this synthesis. In this approach, individual frames or perspectives should be individually considered, then layered on top of each other, with the goal of executives and decision makers being to synthesize them together to form an integrated approach to organizational management. In practice, the approach works similarly to how GIS maps work, such as that which people use every day in Google Maps. And I have a visual of this type of layering dynamic that takes place with these maps in the article. So here, different layers of data, such as physical topography, waterways, roads, buildings, zones, etc., are layered on top of each other to create a map that synthesizes multiple variables together into a single holistic image. I mention all this because I plan on applying this technique to our study of the 20th century. So on one level, we have the official story of the 20th century, which is primarily about nation states, political ideologies, and rival economic systems rising and competing against each other. This is the frame or perspective that most textbooks offer about the history of the 20th century. But as we've seen, there's more to the 20th century than this. On another level, we also find beneath this initial or outer level a story of oligarchy and empire, of a transnational capitalist class that both cooperates and competes with each other for financial and economic control of the world. This is the story that we've been covering in the first 4 articles of this series. Having already introduced and outlined the basics of these first 2 levels or frames of analysis, where America is framed as both a democracy and an oligarchy, now in this article we are going to introduce 2 additional frames or perspectives. The third level or frame we're going to develop has to do with the emergence of a permanent and highly secretive military-industrial complex in America. As we will see, although this layer interfaces with America's capitalist oligarchy at certain levels, it is not, strictly speaking, identical with it, meaning its goals and motivations sometimes overlap with those of oligarchy, but at other times they don't. Its power structure seems to operate independently of the oligarchy, and in fact the oligarchy doesn't seem to have full access to what it's doing, it being secretly hidden within and behind the vast compartmentalized bureaucratic and technological infrastructure of the military-industrial complex. As we will be exploring in this article, the rise of the military-industrial complex coincides with both the rise of science as a dominant social institution and with the onset of the industrial age as the dominant economic paradigm of our times. Indeed, the 3 go hand in hand, with a permanent scientific bureaucracy or technocracy having arisen during this time period within the military-industrial complex. As I will argue, it appears that this permanent technocracy shields and protects the existence of secret scientific research projects, ones that have been in the works since at least the mid-19th century. Again, to reemphasize, this third layer interfaces closely with the second level, the transnational capitalist oligarchy, but is not identical with it. Instead, the secret technocracy that forms the third level of our analysis seems to operate on 2 levels, an outer level that interfaces with oligarchy and an inner level that is deeply hidden, classified, and known only to itself. As we will cover, this inner level has to do with off-the-books, deeply classified research projects and the highly compartmentalized bureaucracies who oversee them. It also has to do with the maintenance of a secret tradition of scientific knowledge, and with the corresponding creation of a fake public science, by means of which the most important breakthrough scientific discoveries being worked on within this hidden technocratic structure are kept hidden in secret. Finally, as a 4th level or frame of analysis, so this was one that goes over top or beyond this 3rd level that I'm talking about, the technocracy. So as a 4th level or frame of analysis, one existing quietly behind the other 3 levels, we are going to revisit the idea that Francis Bacon, back in the 17th century, founded an invisible college of Rosicrucian initiates, and that this secret society has perpetuated itself up to the present day. I argue that this esoteric society is the true invisible government of the world, its ultimate responsibility being to guide the evolving human soul toward a predestined end state that the divine intelligence of the world has planned for it since the beginning of time. In this article, I will only briefly discuss this 4th level, but in future articles we will go deeper into this idea and further explore the hypothesis. In total, it will take numerous articles to lay out and layer together the full story of all 4 perceptual frames. Once we do, The goal is to synthesize them together, with the idea being that the history of the 20th century cannot be understood without factoring in and synthesizing all four together. In the first 4 articles of this series, we worked to develop the first 2 levels of our analysis, with the official story of history being juxtaposed with the story of the rise of oligarchy in America. Now, in this article, part 5, we will begin introducing and developing levels 3 and 4, the existence of a secret scientific research institution tasked with developing various breakthrough technologies, and the existence of a hidden network of secret societies tasked with managing and overseeing this institution. So without further ado, let's jump into it. And that's the end of my intro here. So once again, that was called Reframing the 20th Century, and I hope you can see how this is the methodology that I've been using so far and will be continuing to develop over the course of this and future articles. So without further ado, let's move on to the next section of the article. It's called The Use and Abuse of Scientific Knowledge. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of science and how the Baconian approach to science has been violated over the course of the industrial age and the geopolitical dynamics that have been taking place. And so those things have come into science and sort of corrupted it out of its original foundations. So that's what the topic of this section is going to be. All right, next section, the use and abuse of scientific knowledge. As we first discussed in our previous chapter on Francis Bacon, science was, in its original conception, not viewed as a secular enterprise. Rather, in its initial and most pure form, it was treated as an expression of philosophy, one of philosophy's many branches. Indeed, in its earliest days, science was actually called natural philosophy. Going back in time, we find that originally, scientific knowledge was generated and perpetuated at the level of the priesthood. Secular science had no existence. Thus, in the earliest ages, science was held under the protective umbrella of the temple. Among the high priests of its inner sanctums, there was no difference between religious knowledge and scientific knowledge. To the first scientists, nature was seen as the body of God, with science treated as the act of studying God's outer body so as to learn the inner workings and laws of the divine mind. In the earliest days, to become a scientist, one had to be an initiate. The ancient initiates viewed their task as being to build in accordance with the laws and processes of nature. To do so was to come into alignment with the greater power of the divine mind. In their thinking, the divine mind exists uniformly throughout creation, it being the divine intelligence, which is the source of all laws, structures, and processes found in nature. Because nature was imbued with divine connotations by the ancient high priests, science was treated as a sacred part of their worship practices. It was seen as an essential component of man's great quest to learn and obey God's will and thereby fulfill God's plan for creation. For this reason, the original scientists viewed scientific knowledge as something sacred. To be a scientist was an honor and privilege. Its cultivation was part of one's religious practice. This linking of science, philosophy, and religion gave science an ethical and moral foundation, something it lacks entirely today. To misuse science was seen as a sin against God. Therefore, only the sound philosophical use of scientific knowledge, such as that depicted in Francis Bacon's utopian novel New Atlantis, was permitted. Although he lived and worked in the Middle Ages, Francis Bacon was a master initiate of the ancient philosophical tradition that once treated science in this manner. When he articulated the philosophy behind the scientific method in works like Novum Organum and The Advancement of Learning, he was doing so in the spirit of science's original philosophical form of practice, when it was intimately connected with religion, mysticism, and spirituality. Unfortunately, soon after he articulated his vision for a modernized philosophy of science, his scientific method became co-opted by secular interests who sought to utilize it to develop technologies that would give them power, wealth, and control over others. In other words, science became misused, falling into a corrupted state, becoming yet another instrument of oligarchy, a means for them to grow and consolidate power over the masses. This was perhaps to be expected. During the Kali Yuga, man's psychology becomes dominated by materialistic and egotistical drives and impulses. Science, once detached from its original foundation in the mysteries, quickly became subsumed to materialistic forces. What resulted was the rise of the industrial age, where science fell out of the hands of philosophers and instead came to be dominated by private capitalistic interests like the robber barons of the Gilded Age. The scientific institutions and technological industries these capitalists pioneered, while offering certain benefits to collective mankind, were formed ultimately not with philosophic ideals and goals in mind, but rather with other more secular and individualistic motivations and intentions, such as amassing personal wealth and gaining political power. Not being naive to the larger materialistic motions in human psychology that characterize our current age, it seemed that Francis Bacon found a need to preserve in secret a permanent society who would keep alive the original philosophic approach of science. This he seemed to have done through the elite secret society he was the head of, the Rosicrucian Order. At the foundation of England's colonization of America, Bacon seeded his secret society into the New World. Once established in America, it was linked with an outer network of Freemasonic societies. Together, these secret societies worked to inspire and coordinate the American Revolution, with the inner Rosicrucian order leading and directing the outer Masonic fraternities. The idea here is that, although both were founded by a common individual, Francis Bacon, these two secret societies, Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, are not actually identical. Rather, one exists as an inner core, the other as an outer body. At certain periods, they become connected, and at other times they delink and function autonomously. During times of separation, the Masonic fraternity, and other secret societies like it, tend to drift toward the same direction of materialism and secularism that the rest of society is moving in. This is more or less what seems to have happened to a large part of Freemasonry during the centuries following the American Revolution. In particular, with the rise of the industrial age in the 19th century and the corresponding emergence of imperial oligarchies in Britain, Germany, and America during this period, the Rosicrucian fraternity seems to have disappeared into hiding, with their outer vehicle, the Freemasons, subsequently falling into an increasingly secular and political orientation. Commenting on the general drift of secret societies during the 18th and 19th centuries toward this shift toward a materialistic, secular, and political orientation, and consequently away from a philosophical and religious focus, Manly Hall writes that, quote, "The world has lost interest in the divine origin of its cultural and economic institutions, and no longer pays homage to orders of guardian spirits. As the fashions in human thinking changed, secret societies also altered their natures and appearances. Foundations were shifted from the solid rock of things spiritual to the shifting sand of things material." Elaborating, he writes that this shift away from philosophy and toward political focus began to emerge in Europe during that part of the medieval period known as the Dark Ages. During this period, the almost complete absence of a public program and the universal disregard for the life and rights of the private citizen led to the creation of several powerful fraternities, the members of which were brought together for the purpose of mutual protection. Once this process of secularization began, it seems to have blossomed into a situation where a wide range of secret societies emerged, ones motivated by a diverse array of ideologies and interests. Some were highly idealistic and philosophical in their motivations, while others became driven by more materialistic, political, and economic concerns. Commenting on the polarization of secret societies into contrasting spiritualist and materialist camps that took place during this period, Hall writes that secret societies came to naturally align themselves under two general headings. The first seeks to improve humanity by fostering a program of universal progress and improvement. The second group would limit opportunity to privileged political, economic, or religious classes in order that these classes might continue to dominate and exploit the collective interests. Thus, we find during this period oligarchy-oriented secret societies like the Round Table Society of Britain and the Skull and Bone Society of America emerging. These elite societies lack entirely the philosophic spirit of the original esoteric secret societies, like the Rosicrucians, and are instead driven entirely by the pursuit of power and prestige. During this period, we also see the emergence of all manner of occult orders and sects, each claiming to possess the key to universal knowledge, spiritual power, and mental illumination, but in reality possessing nothing of the sort. Many pseudo-Masonic lodges fell into these types of illusions, with only a relatively small number adhering to the original ideals of Francis Bacon, the modern order's founding father and original Grand Master. It is also during this period that we see secret societies emerge who began engaging in secret scientific and technological research programs. Ones that sought to apply occult systems of knowledge, like alchemy, toward the advancement of modern science and technology. As we will be exploring in this article, this particular form of secret society rose in the 19th century to play a major role in the unfoldment of world affairs. But as we will also discover, messing around with occult sciences like alchemy is an inherently dangerous activity. The misapplication of occult knowledge is the foundation of black magic. If you get the formula wrong, or you apply it to the wrong ends, you will surely bring about much destruction, both to yourself and others. So while Bacon's dream was to develop a science based around the principles of esoteric philosophy, any group that rises to try to imitate his plan, but which falls short of the philosophic standards, wisdom, and disciplines that he advocated for, in terms of how they plan to use their inventions, will surely fall into the realm of black magic, as they will by definition lack the intelligence and insight necessary to wield occult power constructively and benevolently. In short, only those who perfectly follow the philosophical ideals of Bacon will be able to successfully utilize the types of breakthrough technologies promised by application of his scientific method. All others will fall inevitably into black magic, creating instead a shadow version of the Solomon's House archetype Bacon originally set forth in his book New Atlantis. Here we might look at something like the Manhattan Project as being a manifestation of this type of corruption, where scientific knowledge is used not to create wealth and prosperity, but rather to build an instrument of destruction that greater shadow forces within society, the capitalist oligarchy and the military-industrial complex being two notable ones, that these can utilize to further their own selfish purposes. Philosophically speaking, any scientist working to develop weapon systems, mechanisms for psychological control, or other type of deep state instrument is misusing and abusing the institution of science. We must remember and appreciate that science was never originally intended to be a secular institution. But in the Kali Yuga, the age of materiality, this is exactly the direction we find it going in. Governments, entrepreneurs, investors, industrialists, militaries, think tanks, and occult societies everywhere have long since fallen out of alignment with Bacon's original philosophic vision for science. Consequently, they have instead come to practice it in a deformed and corrupted form. This separation between science and philosophy has increased through time, with things culminating in the modern cult of scientific materialism or scientism, which has infected nearly all parts of Western civilization. Here, science takes on a form that is literally the exact opposite of Francis Bacon's original conception for it. One of the dominant characteristics of the modern cult of scientific materialism is that it detaches the pursuit and use of scientific knowledge from any underlying ethical program or system of idealism or self-discipline. As evidence of this, Manly Hall asks us to consider the modern university. Why do the young men and women of today go to college, he asks. Some seek social connections, others desire to fit themselves for economic superiority, still others are athletically inclined, and only a small percentage sincerely desire learning for its own sake. There are no special standards either demanded or expected other than a fair scholastic standing. We graduate millions of young men and women somewhat skilled, but still deficient in those basic character requirements which alone can bring them security. The result has been an increase in temporal empire, an intensification of skill, and a tremendous increase of competitive and destructive tendencies. The human being came into the possession of skill without the wisdom to administer that skill. He became strong without virtue, and has used his strength to become rich without principle. As Manly Hall pointed out, two consequences have resulted from the misuse of science. On one hand, the release of scientific knowledge into society has fostered a widespread increase in the capability, skill, and aptitude of individuals and organizations in modern civilization. But on the other hand, there has also been a capture of this institution by forces and interest groups within the oligarchy who misuse science as a means to pursue their own misguided ambitions and plans. As a result of this capture, Manly Hall wryly observes that man, unconscious of the universal edict which demands self-mastery, settled down to the intensely modern program of making himself a ruler over his physical environment. Clearly, the use of science to further the control and dominance of society by an elite oligarchical ruling class is a perversion of Bacon's original ideal for the institution. But sadly, today this situation has become the norm for science. It is therefore of the greatest importance that we address and change this situation for the better. How do we do this? We can start by relinking science back to its original foundations in philosophy, and the manner that Francis Bacon outlined in his original conception of the institution. For more on this, see my previous chapter on Francis Bacon. But for now, let's continue on with our unfolding narrative of the secret history of the 20th century. So that's the end of that section. And I thought that very relevant to go into before we go into the details of what we'll be talking about. Because this links things back with that whole series on Francis Bacon that I did. And I did that for a reason, to inform the discussion on science and technology that we're going to be doing in this chapter. So anyway, that was the end of that section. Once again, that was called The Use and Abuse of Scientific Knowledge. So next up is a section where we're going to be picking up the historical narrative and talking about some of the events that took place preceding the 20th century, the scientific age. And so we're going to be considering the Sonora Aero Club. So that's what this next section is called. All right, the Sonora Aero Club. In our first article in this ongoing series on the secret history of the 20th century, we noted how Britain and Germany came to adopt two competing models of capitalism. One industrial and state-focused, which is the German model, and the other financial and banker-focused, which was the British model. Each system would come to be characterized by its own type of oligarchy. Industrial capitalism, such as that favored by Germany, favors the rise of entrepreneurs, industrialists, scientists, and technocrats, while financial capitalism, the model favored by Britain, favors the rise of bankers, merchants, landowners, and aristocrats. In the course of American history, both influences would move into the country and take root, with America's industrial and entrepreneurial base preferring Germany's industrial capitalism model, and its East Coast banking elite instead preferring the British Empire's financial capitalism approach. We noted in earlier chapters that the three countries primarily associated with the rise of modern capitalism, industry, and empire, England, Germany, and America, were also the three primary strongholds during the Revolutionary era for Bacon's two secret societies to operate in, the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons. It seems that after the Revolutionary period was over, these secret societies shifted their focus away from the old goals that they had, such as defeating the monarchs and church, which they had already done, and moved instead toward the accomplishment of necessary new tasks, such as coordinating the rise of the industrial age and managing the development of scientific knowledge that would accompany it. As we've seen, this new mission had to be pursued against the rising pressures of capitalism, oligarchy, and empire. In particular, the two dominant European powers of the time, Britain and Germany, were each pursuing a model of economic development that was incompatible with each other, with the Germans favoring an industrial-centered approach to capitalism and Britain a banking and financial one. In the case of Britain, its capitalist oligarchy came into the country via a network that originated in medieval Venice. The founding of the Bank of England in 1688 consolidated the power of these banking oligarchs over the British state, with the subsequent rise of the British Empire emerging as a result of their machinations. Meanwhile, in Germany, a different type of oligarchy took root, one that was focused on investing in the development of industry and technology. To work, this approach, called industrial capitalism, required a close working relationship to develop between government planners, military strategists, banks, industrial corporations, and scientists. As the history of the 20th century demonstrates, in particular its two world wars, the oligarchies behind these two powers competed with one another, each advocating for a different model of capitalism. The battle between them would also be carried out within America, as representatives from each oligarchy would attempt to co-opt America's domestic political and economic systems in order to advance their own interests. One way this covert competition took place was through the work of various secret societies. In the case of Britain's influence, its imperial secret societies, such as the Round Table groups of Lord Milner and the All Saints Society of Oxford, were ported over, with Americanized versions established, with the Council on Foreign Relations and the Skull and Bone Society of Yale being two prominent examples. In the case of Germany, we also find certain imperial secret organizations originating from their lands coming in and taking root. While the legacy of these Germanic secret societies is a little more obscure to pinpoint, they're not impossible to find. One contemporary researcher, Walter Bosley, has uncovered a very interesting trace of their existence in his research into an obscure mid-19th century secret society called the Sonora Aero Club, which was, believe it or not, engaging in research to develop anti-gravity flying machines. This is again back in the mid-19th century. In his research, Bosley references the existence of a series of writings and diagrams produced by a German-American engineer named Charles Delschau, who talks of working with a team of engineers in California during the 1850s who were financed by an obscure society of Prussian financiers called NIMSA NYMZA, who were seeking to develop anti-gravity flying vehicles, or arrows as they were then called. The project took place in Sonora, California, with the secret society of research scientists working there calling themselves the Sonora Aero Club. Delschow declares that the project was financed by an obscure but powerful, politically oriented secret society from Prussia called NIMZA, as we mentioned, which is an acronym with an unknown meaning. Delschow tells how the Sonora group, in the 1850s, designed, built, and flew rudimentary flying machines called arrows, with successful test flights taking place all around the rural expanses of Yosemite, California. His journals contain diagrammatic sketches of some of the arrow models the group experimented with, and one of these is included in the article. In his journals, Delschow implies that the Sonora group he was a part of was not the only group conducting this type of research in the U.S. at the time. Other groups with unknown backers existed, although he did not mention details about any of them, perhaps because he didn't know. The social and political motives for why these other research groups were developing anti-gravity technologies is unclear. Different groups may have been motivated by different aims. But the common link that all appear to have shared in common was the use of an occult alchemical approach to the science of physics. This approach was based around the concept of a universal medium, or ether, which in this model is understood to exist as the common substrate and source for all objects, forces, and energies in the universe. Based on this ether-based approach to physics, the Sonora Aero Club and other secret research societies like it were able to successfully design and develop flying anti-gravity machines, once again called arrows. While details about these secret research programs remain elusive, the underlying pattern is obvious. Occult knowledge is bubbling up to the surface, it being clothed now in the language of modern science and put to use in the task of developing technology. Here we find science becoming detached from its spiritual and philosophical roots. Originally, this type of knowledge was protected within the traditional barriers of an initiation system, which the ancient esoteric orders used as a means to wall off and protect the most prized of their occult alchemical formulas, lest they fall into the hands of the profane who could not help but misuse and abuse them. But now, in the industrial age, the cat is out of the bag, so to speak, and researchers with various motivations and ideologies are now working to uncover the secret formulas for harnessing nature's secret laws so as to develop technologies for commercial and/or military use. These new technologies, once developed, may then be put to use for any number of purposes, constructive or destructive, by whoever is financing and leading these research projects. This gives these individuals an immense amount of power. But because they did not amass this power by successfully passing through a philosophic initiation, they are not trained or prepared to use this power and knowledge wisely. Returning to the topic of Charles Delschow and the Sonora Aero Club, we quickly discovered the potential dangers of the situation. Delschow writes how the Sonora Club was originally founded by an American alchemical researcher and scientist named Peter Minnis, who was the leader of a 62-member team. Before founding the organization, he had originally been a mining engineer who had, as a hobby, begun dabbling in alchemical research. After achieving success with his experiments, he shifted his efforts over to developing technologies based around his principles, and this is how the Secret Research Society came into being. According to Bosley, Minnis discovered the secret formula for an anti-gravity liquid as a byproduct of his alchemical research, where he was attempting to extract gold from quartz via a chemical method. This anti-gravity liquid is a key element that makes the anti-gravity flying machines, or arrows, that his organization was developing work. The flying machines he designed using this liquid were also engineered to harness natural atmospheric energy currents called telluric currents. These are pattern waves of etheric energy that manifest within and through the electromagnetic fields of the Earth. The arrows that Minnis and company built were engineered to surf or sail this grid like ships on the currents of the seas. According to Delschow, Minnis and his research society had originally made their key discoveries independently without the support of an outside organization. But in time they ran out of money and were forced to look for outside funding to continue the project. Somehow, Minnis made contact with the German NIMZA group, who were politically motivated German nationalists seeking to unify, industrialize, and militarize Prussia as a united German state. With these aims in mind, they agreed to finance his group's research, ostensibly as a means to further their political objectives. Here, Bosley highlights the idea that Minnis had become associated with the Prussian nationalists only out of necessity. This is important to note because it helps explain what happened next around the year 1860. Delschow, in his journals, writes how once the Sonora Aero Club began having success with their aero technologies, word of their success reached back to their European backers, and they were soon visited by a Prussian military officer who approached the club and suggested they construct arrows designed for warfare. According to Delschow, Peter Minnis, the leader of the club, rebuffed the Prussian officer and declined his request. Apparently, this was not taken well by Nimza. Perhaps not coincidentally, Minnis was shortly thereafter killed in an accident. Afterwards, the Sonora Aero Club was disbanded, and Delschow returned to Europe. As Delschow made clear, other secret societies besides his California group were also working on anti-gravity research at the time, though he does not give specifics. Texas is one possible location for where this research may have been continued. South America is another. Historical records from South America indicate that airship sightings took place in Chile in the 1860s and Venezuela in the 1880s. It is well established that Germany, the homeland of Nimza, established colonies throughout South America during the 1800s, most notably in Argentina, but also in Chile, Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Perhaps the same financiers behind the Sonora Aero Club moved their operations south and continued their research there. So that's the end of that section. That is going to set the stage for a lot of things that are to come, but that was the Sonora Aero Club. And this is talking about events that were taking place in the 1850s. This is before the Civil War, and we're talking about anti-gravity flying machines. Now, kind of a cruder form, kind of a steampunk form almost, but nonetheless, the technology existed because the alchemical principles that they were based on, these are very old ideas. So, as we saw, the whole research project came as a byproduct of alchemical research that its founder, Peter Minnis, was doing during this time period. So anyway, that was the story of the Sonora Aero Club. So now we're going to move things forward a couple decades and consider the airship sightings of 1896 to 1897. All right, so this next section is called the airship sightings of 1896 to 1897. We're going to further develop the story. And in the beginning here, I have two newspaper clippings, photocopies of them from this period, which describe these sightings. All right, so let's pick up with this section. For a few decades, airship sightings stayed relatively quiet in North America. That is, until the years 1896 to 1897, when an unprecedented wave of sightings took place across the country. In his book, UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, UFO historian Richard Dolan calls these the first true wave of UFO sightings in the modern world. To this day, they remain a genuine mystery. Over 1,500 newspaper articles discuss them. Overviewing the situation that took place, Walter Bosley writes that the 1897 airship mystery concerned the sightings of large airships over major cities throughout the United States, mostly west of the Mississippi River between late 1896 and throughout the following year. The sightings were reported in several newspapers and witnessed by large populations, among which reports from respected citizens were taken and published. The locations where these sightings took place include Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Kansas, Missouri, New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. Describing the nature of the airships reported in these sightings, Dolan writes that they flew with intensely bright searchlights, sometimes very high up, sometimes low. Bosley offers further details, noting that many of these airships had open air decks. They utilized spinning propellers and had spot lamps. They were crafted of known materials and of wood and fabric and metals, which are known elements. Some reportedly carried very human passengers, sporting fashionable attire of the day, and enjoying tea to the music performed by a small live band on board, as if the flight were a pleasure cruise. Dolan informs us that, in some circumstances, witnesses claimed to meet the entirely human occupants of these ships, who unfortunately never seemed to give away much valuable information. For example, in Rocklin, Texas, one of the pilots, an ordinary man, asked for lubricating oil, chisels, and bluestone. Then he paid for them, presumably with valid currency. Afterward, the airship took off like a shot out of a gun. Bosley gives another example of an airship sighting, pointing to a Dallas Morning News article from 1897 that reports of a local resident, C.G. Williams, encountering the occupants of a cigar-shaped airship that had landed on the ground. Bosley writes that, in the article, Williams reported an encounter with 3 crewmen of this airship. The captain of this craft explained how it works with electricity and moving parts. Williams was told about the airship traveling from New York to Indiana and down to Texas. This man even gave Williams letters to mail for him and told Williams that if he does not disclose the names on the envelopes, the crew and he would take Williams on a trip to Mexico and South America. While few details exist about who or what organizations were behind these mysterious airships, some of the passengers gave out their names to onlookers. In a few of the sightings, these names were reported to newspapers. In his research, Walter Bosley notes the frequent appearance of the last name Wilson in these reports, with different individuals bearing the name popping up at various points and locations. He also notes how this last name appeared in the original Sonora Aero Club reports of Delshow, and it further turns up in later 20th century accounts of secret government UFO research projects. Summarizing the situation, Bosley writes that virtually unknown to history, but well known among serious scholars of the airship mysteries, to a point of iconic status even, are the Wilsons. Described almost in terms of the Wizard of Oz, the Wilsons have left their fingerprints throughout the murkier, speculative corners of aviation and the U.S. space program right up to the present day. In his research, Bosley discovered references to 3 different Wilsons among the records of 19th century flying airship sightings, when multiple witnesses claim to have met an airship pilot or crewman going by the name of Wilson. The first of these Wilsons actually dates back to the Sonora Aero Club and was reported by Delshow, a man named Tosh Wilson. Then, subsequently identified with the 1897 airship mystery are 2 more Wilsons, Hiram Wilson and son Willard Wilson. They are identified as investors and builders of an airship reported on in the San Antonio Express on April 26, 1897. Furthermore, just days prior to this San Antonio sighting, in the Houston Daily Post of April 21st, and repeated in the Bastrop Advisor of April 24th, there is a Wilson identified as an airship crewman who claimed to spectators that the airship was one of 5 built in a quiet village in Iowa. Let's pause and take note that one of these Wilsons goes by the name Hiram, a clear Masonic reference. Does this indicate that Masonic networks in America were at least partially involved in coordinating the development of the 19th century flying airships? Given Masonry's history of involvement in utilizing esoteric knowledge for engineering purposes, it seems likely this would be the case. Notably, in his research into later 20th century developments in secret government research into anti-gravity, Bosley again uncovers the name Hiram Wilson. On this subject, Bosley offers a personal anecdote of his own father's account of having met a Hiram Wilson during his work in the 1950s on a secret anti-gravity research program for the American government. Bosley writes that these encounters occurred while the source was enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in the 1950s. According to Charles Bosley, who I assume is his father, who was a staff sergeant at the time, Wilson and his father Hiram, affectionately known as the Professor, were in charge of a classified program involving what were essentially anti-gravity aerial platforms. Bosley continues that there was a Hiram Wilson identified by name in the 1890s airship milieu, and that my father claimed to have met a Hiram Wilson, whom he described as the Professor or sometimes the Old Man, can't be ignored here. You have 2 Hiram Wilsons associated with tales of anti-gravity and flying machines. The way Bosley and other researchers discuss this mysterious Wilson, or these mysterious Wilsons, plural, reminds me somewhat of the reverential way that 18th century esotericists discussed the mysterious sages Cagliostro and Saint Germain, who were 2 of the guiding spirits behind the democratic movements of the era. Both were prominent Masons, and both were secret masters of the alchemical arts. Of the Wilsons, Bosley writes that if there ever was a particular man who came near living up to the description of the L. Frank Baum archetype, meaning the Wizard of Oz, it would be the man behind the airship legend curtain, referred to simply as Wilson. Anyone who has ever looked into the great airship mystery learns of the Wilsons, as does anyone who digs deep enough into the UFO question, with the name Wilson sometimes whispered in reverent tones. He is said to be the greatest genius you've never heard of, his life spanning most of the 20th century. Wilson is the man behind flying saucers, some say. Adding to this mystery, Walter Bosley himself, in his own career with the Air Force, also tells of meeting an additional source with direct knowledge of this mysterious Wilson. This source told him that said Wilson was the most brilliant man no one has ever heard of. And that's the end of that section. So that was called the airship sightings of 1896 to 1897. So we're developing a pattern here, a historical pattern that definitively points to the existence of secret research and technological development programs. And presumably these are using a type of concept of physics and science that is unknown to public scientists or modern sort of intellectuals who are using a different model of physics. So we're going to be going more into this idea about a two-tracked program of science, a sort of secret classified program and then a public program. And so that's going to be going into in the next few sections. And so now in this next follow-up section, having given this context with the Sonora Aero Club and with these airship mysteries, these taking place in the latter decades of the 19th century, now in the very final decade or final 15 years or so of the 20th century, here comes Nikola Tesla into the picture. So we have this, system of secret science being developed over time based on alchemical principles, but kept away from sort of public awareness and public knowledge about what these ideas are. And so now we have Nikola Tesla coming onto the scene, and as we'll see, he's this kind of renegade scientist and maverick, not part of any secret society, it seems, sort of a self-driven individual, and he ends up on his own coming up with and kind of rediscovering whatever core ideas the secret research groups seem to be using, because the technologies and inventions he talks about coming up with later in his life are ones that seem to mirror the capabilities of these 19th century research programs. So we're going to be going to that story coming up. All right, so this next section is called Along Comes Nikola Tesla. And he's going to enter the picture now after or right around this period where these airship sightings are taking place. So let's jump into it. Summarizing the material covered above, we note that by the turn of the century, various research projects centered around the development of anti-gravity flying machines were being secretly pursued by one or more secret societies, with significant breakthroughs achieved and successful prototypes developed. As we also covered, these research programs into anti-gravity were based on an approach to science and physics that was rooted in the esoteric principles of alchemy. By 1900, these secret scientific projects had already been underway in the Americas for decades and had obtained significant results. It appears that different research projects were financed and developed by different groups, which likely competed against each other. Presumably, different research organizations were pursuing different goals for different reasons, some philosophic, some financial, and some political. Keep in mind that this was an era of great power politics, when oligarchies in Britain, Germany, and America were locked in competition with one another over the quest for world domination. In this circumstance, technologies like the flying airships would have been of utmost interest to military and national security interests in each of these competing imperial states. In America, this period was also the time of the robber barons, with individuals like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller seeking to establish monopoly control over key industries so as to solidify their top-down control over the economy. Clearly, these capitalists would have an interest in financing and controlling the development of the flying airships and other forms of breakthrough technology. Certainly, German industrialists and financiers were interested, as Delschau's discussion of the mysterious Nimsa group indicates. It is also more than likely that Masonic groups and other types of secret societies were involved in these research programs, as the repeated mention of the name Hiram Wilson suggests. Here we should keep in mind that during this period, Masonry was not as tightly organized as it would later become. Therefore, different types of Masonic organizations may have existed and been involved in this research, some derived from the original Baconian lineage, and some not. Overall, in this period, we discover many different overlapping groups showing an interest in researching and developing breakthrough technologies like anti-gravity flying machines. Given the underlying political circumstances outlined above, there would be a clear incentive for each of these groups to keep their scientific and technological advances secret and proprietary. There would also be a clear incentive and need for the consolidation and centralization of these research projects to take place, particularly on a national security level. As we move into the 20th century, we see this consolidation taking place. Perhaps the two world wars were opportunities to make this happen. Fatefully, this dynamic and highly combustible situation was the environment that famous scientist, inventor, and mystic Nikola Tesla would unknowingly enter into during the latter decades of the 19th century as he began his career as a maverick scientist and inventor. Tesla emerges onto the scene as a self-guided prodigy and savant. As far as I can tell, he wasn't a member of any secret society and didn't inherit his knowledge or techniques from any external source or tradition. Rather, as he himself states, his inventions and scientific breakthroughs came to him in an intuitive manner, through visions and dreams. Like a true mystic, Tesla once wrote that, quote, "My brain is only a receiver. In the universe, there is a core from which we obtain knowledge, strength, and inspiration. I have not penetrated into the secrets of this core, but I know that it exists." Seemingly, it was by tapping into this center of self-consciousness within himself that he derived the ideas and equations that would later make him famous. Adam Trombley, a successor of Tesla's who would later, during the 1980s, reproduce and validate several key breakthrough scientific and technological ideas of Tesla's, discussed in a 1980 speech how the famous inventor's great insights originated from an intuitive source within himself. Trombley notes how Tesla first saw or visualized what he built. He often would see these devices in their totality spontaneously. Then, having first visualized his desired device, he would describe his vision to a draftsman before then working to build it. According to Trombley, the draftsman was his interface with substance. Overall, Tesla takes on the air of someone born into this life with a karmic debt to fulfill, someone internally driven to dedicate their life toward accomplishing a great work in service of mankind's larger collective evolution. This he did. Some of Tesla's early inventions have become well known and serve as the foundation of the energy systems utilized by today's modern industrial economies. Thomas Bearden, an electrical engineer active from the mid to late 20th century, remarked how Tesla literally helped to bring in the electrical 20th century. Had it not been for Nikola Tesla, your cities would still be dark. You still would not have electric power, and you'd still be struggling around in the dark. So yes, Nikola Tesla was important to us. More specifically, Tesla made possible the practical transmission of electric power. His alternating current system, which in the late 19th century competed against and eventually won out over Thomas Edison's direct current system, remains the foundation of the modern electrical grid. But while some of Tesla's inventions have become popularly accepted and been adopted worldwide, other of his breakthrough ideas and inventions were left intentionally undeveloped, even going so far as to being actively suppressed. Summarizing Nikola Tesla's legacy, Joseph P. Farrell writes that no single scientist has contributed so much to modern society and culture, and yet no other scientist or engineer has been subject to such a long and thorough eradication of his name from encyclopedias and books on science, invention, and technology to the extent of Tesla. In a moment, we'll touch on some of Tesla's more controversial ideas and inventions, ones that would later get him into trouble. But to begin with, let's investigate the story of how he developed the alternating current electrical transmission system, as it is what first established his career and brought him his initial fame. Nikola Tesla arrived in America in 1884, reaching these shores at the age of 28 with but $1 and a dream. Already a great scientific genius, upon arrival he immediately went to see Thomas Edison, who had just gained fame for inventing the first commercially available light bulb. Recognizing his talent, Edison gave Tesla his first job, with promise of a hefty commission should he succeed. His task? Fix the direct current generators that Edison had designed to get electricity out to the masses so that they could use his patented light bulb product. At the time, Edison envisioned that his proposed electrical system would be wired into every home and factory in America, where its power could be metered, promising him and his financial backers a hefty profit. The problem was, his direct current system was too inefficient and fragile to be practical. His machines kept breaking down, and his grand plans weren't coming to fruition. Edison therefore tasked Tesla with solving the problem. After a few months, Tesla found a way to solve the issues that were plaguing Edison's direct current generators, getting them finally to work. But Edison then cheated Tesla out of his promised commission, which was at that time a hefty $50,000 fee. Rightly outraged, Tesla quit on the spot, disgusted at Edison's greed. Tesla then struck out on his own and soon came up with a superior alternating current electrical transmission system, which he then got American entrepreneur and financier George Westinghouse to bankroll. At the time, the established scientific consensus was that Tesla's method would be impossible. But like we said, Tesla was not informed or inspired by normal scientific thinking. His breakthroughs came from an inner, intuitive source. It was this internal connection with his own psyche that inspired him to formulate the designs for his now essential alternating current electrical system. By achieving what many thought was impossible and coming up with a viable electrical transmission system that no contemporary scientists believed would work, Tesla proved himself a real scientific pioneer and maverick whose inventions would utilize a non-orthodox approach to physics and energy. Tesla, in association with Westinghouse, debuted his breakthrough invention in memorable fashion. He won the contract to light the famous 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, lighting up 100,000 light bulbs instantaneously in front of a crowd of thousands, generating what truly must have been an awe-inspiring and culturally transformative moment. Nothing like this had ever been seen before. Tesla had changed the world. Soon, his alternating current electrical transmission system would be adopted worldwide. To this day, it is still in use. As Bearden told us, and as should now be clear, without Tesla and his breakthrough insights, we'd still be in the dark today. All right, so that was the end of that section on Nikola Tesla. That wasn't the end of our discussion of Tesla, but before moving on to further investigate this great genius, we are going to pause and pivot a little bit, and we're going to consider Albert Einstein and the story of general relativity. And here we're going to really be comparing Tesla's approach, which was similar to the alchemical approach used by these secret research projects that we were discussing. We're going to juxtapose their approach with that of Albert Einstein. And we're going to take a look at the story of Einstein's general relativity theory in a bit of a critical mode of thinking. So for those who are big fans of Einstein, prepare to be disappointed in this next section. But we'll get into that in one second. All right, next section, Albert Einstein and the story of general relativity. Already by the time of Tesla, we find a marked polarization emerging within the scientific community about what the foundation of material reality is. Some, like Tesla, favored the idea that energy, form, and force originate from a universal energetic medium termed the ether. Others, like Edison, favored a more materialistic concept of physics, one that factors out the ether in favor of alternate explanations. One such alternate explanation that caught popularity would come with Albert Einstein and his famous relativity model of physics. By the turn of the century, thanks to the confluence of a series of circumstances, the ether-based camp that Tesla was a part of was dwindling, and alternate models like that invented by Einstein rose in popularity. This is an interesting development because we note that Tesla's ether-based approach was the foundation of his breakthrough inventions. It also seemed to be the basis of the technological research programs being conducted in secret by groups like the Sonora Aero Club. So if the ether-based model of physics was capable of producing real-world results like the ones these camps created, why would it have fallen out of fashion? As Tesla's track record of inventions proves, clearly the ether-based model of physics is accurate and capable of being utilized in order to successfully engineer technologies. And yet, going against this fact, we find during the same period the unrelenting rise of materialistic scientific paradigms that seek to displace, with cult-like zeal, this ether-based model of physics, denying its scientific validity. As I will be arguing, this paradoxical development was likely the result of a deliberately engineered strategy and conspiracy hatched by a confluence of interests, including high finance, strategists within the national security state, and possibly also various secret societies. It seems that these groups carefully enacted a plan to systematically cover up and classify the entire paradigm of ether physics, thereby shielding it away from the world's attention and replacing with a variety of alternate pseudoscientific explanations that aren't actually right, but which academics and public intellectuals are led to believe in. In this way, the truly breakthrough technologies that were being developed using ether physics could be kept secret and private, something of vital importance to national security interests within the deep state. Furthermore, It also appears that these machinations were helped along by certain synchronistic events, which developed concurrently with these larger conspiratorial motions and helped enable this plan to move forward successfully. Two of these synchronicities we will be discussing shortly. In my eyes, the existence of these synchronicities implies the presence of a larger fate or karmic destiny at work, as if there was an inevitability and secret underlying rationality behind events taking place in the world during this period. In a way, the karmically fated life of Nikola Tesla serves almost as a microcosm of this idea, implying that there is a tight synchronicity between his life story and the overall development of events taking place within the world soul during this time period. It therefore follows that, by highlighting certain trends and developments in Tesla's life, we can infer valuable information about the larger situation playing out within collective society as a whole during this time period. In particular, the deliberate subjugation of Tesla's work by the powers that be allows us to infer something about the ongoing activities of the deep state during this period, which, as the story of the Sonera Aero Club indicates, was at this time fast emerging into existence. Returning back now to our discussion of synchronicity, we note that while the hidden world of secret anti-gravity research based on ether physics was taking place in California, Texas, and other locales, a famous scientific experiment was being carried out to test the validity of ether theory by two academics. This was called the Michelson-Morley experiment. Because those in academia, as well as the rest of civilian society, had at that time no way of learning about the secret scientific research programs being conducted by groups like the Sonora Aero Club, for them the topic of the ether's existence was still up for scientific debate. In their eyes, it remained an unproven theory. But despite it being unproven, it remained popular, as it was the most reasonable explanation for how electromagnetic waves propagate through space. One question up for debate: was this either a static, inert medium, or was it dynamic and luminiferous, as the old alchemists maintained? Describing the state of etheric theory within academia around the turn of the century, Robert L. Henderson writes, "In the latter part of the last century, the prevailing scientific concept was that light was a form of wave motion, which propagated through a medium called the luminiferous ether, or simply the ether for short, which was assumed to fill the universe. It was further assumed that light traveled with the velocity c with respect to the reference frame of the ether, and that the Earth was also traveling through the ether with some unknown velocity v. It was therefore thought that the velocity of the Earth through the ether could be determined if an observer could measure the velocities, with respect to the Earth, of two light beams, one of which was traveling in the same direction as the Earth's direction of motion through the ether, and the other of which was traveling in the opposite direction, in which case one should find the velocities to be c minus v and c plus v, respectively, from which the velocity of the Earth through the ether could be readily determined. During the 1880s, two academic professors, A. Michelson and E. Morley, performed what would become a very famous experiment to test this idea. The experiment is famous because its results have led academia and other public science institutions to reject the ether concept entirely. The problem is, the experiment didn't actually disprove the ether theory, but the widespread belief that it had spread like wildfire and became quickly institutionalized into a dogma within the academic community. To this day, the experiment is reported to prove that there is no ether, but again, in actuality, it does no such thing. And for details of the experiment and the different ways of interpretation that resulted from it, you can see Henderson's book, which is called The Return to Common Sense. This course of events, that the entire public sphere would come to believe that the ether-based physics being utilized in secret research projects was wrong and should be abandoned, was quite convenient for the secret societies and deep state institutions engaging in this research at the time. Given that they wanted to keep their research secret and private, what could be better than to shut down any public interest in the topic? Meanwhile, the academic community who bought this lie seemed primed and ready to accept it, almost as if a greater archetype was impressing itself upon their psyches and influencing their worldviews to develop in a certain trajectory. Certainly, we see this pattern manifesting in every other sphere of life, with a widespread tendency toward illusion, materialism, and secularity setting in. Why should this motion not also swoop in to affect academia? As a result of the widespread misinterpretation of the Michelson-Morley experiment, a space was opened up within the public mind for an alternative physics to be developed, one that could now replace the now discredited, but actually not really, ether model. In comes Einstein and his relativity theory. It emerged within this new era where academic science was looking for a new explanation of physical phenomena, one that didn't require a concept of either to work. Einstein's 1905 special theory of relativity entered the scene as one of these attempts at establishing a new non-ether based paradigm for physics. In his theory, Einstein contends that there was no light conducting medium. Another one of his background assumptions was that the speed of light remains a constant with respect to all reference frames. In his book, The Return of Common Sense, Robert Henderson outlines the many problematic assumptions baked into Einstein's theory. I won't go into all of them, but the general theme is that Einstein assumed a number of ideas that were unreasonable, unphilosophical, and rationally impossible. One of these being that light does not need a medium to transmit, and another being that the speed of light is a constant to all reference frames. On this subject, Henderson writes that although he could never derive the equations necessary to substantiate his assumptions, Einstein continued to believe that they were true. Initially, Einstein found little support in the academic community for his ideas. As Henderson informs us, Einstein's proposal was given very little serious consideration at the time. It was recognized by the scientific community that his mathematical derivations were meaningless. However, the rational impossibility of Einstein's proposal was never pointed out, and the paper continued to stand as a scientific document. Later, in 1916, Einstein followed up his original special theory of relativity with an updated general theory of relativity. In essence, this paper attempted to argue that gravity was caused by curvatures of space and time. Henderson describes the work. Using an obscure form of mathematics known as Riemannian geometry, which was capable of expressing non-physical, imaginary spatial forms, Einstein developed esoteric equations which ostensibly expressed his general theory. In his book, Henderson notes several key differences between the abstract form of geometry Einstein was using and the traditional Euclidean form that had up until then been utilized. For example, he points out that whereas classical Euclidean geometry incorporates only the three known physical dimensions of space, which are width, height, and depth, Riemannian geometry permits the incorporation of any number of additional dimensions such as time, pressure, volume, temperature, mass, etc. He then notes that although it is possible to express the coordinates of hypothetical types of space in more than the three dimensions of Euclidean geometry, it should be understood that space expressed in these multidimensional terms exists only in an abstract imaginary sense and is impossible to visualize physically. Therefore, mathematics based on such multidimensional concepts of space is useful only as a mental exercise and has no application to the real physical world. Henderson informs us that once again, Einstein's theories were, at first, given very little serious consideration, since few, if any, scientists could understand Einstein's arcane equations. Furthermore, common sense dictated that space, which has no shape of itself and consists of nothingness, in Henderson's commentary, that this space could neither be curved, nor produces the forces of gravity, nor could time be made to vary for any reason. These were all fundamental components of Einstein's theory, and none of them make rational sense. Again, these are all assumptions that are unphilosophical and have no basis in Baconian science. But Einstein baked them into his formulas anyway, and when his theories were eventually accepted, these assumptions also became accepted. They then became used to justify a greater materialistic concept of life, one where life is not interconnected through an ether but fundamentally separated as individual billiard ball type forms on a sloped and curved space-time comprised of abstract emptiness. Here's where the idea of synchronicity comes into play. While Einstein's exotic relativity theory was not immediately accepted by the scientific community, a fortuitous event would take place 3 years after its initial publication, one that would have the effect of bringing about the rapid, widespread embracement of Einstein's ideas by academics and public intellectuals worldwide. This synchronistic event was the 1919 discovery by astronomer A. Eddington that gravitational deflections in starlight were evidenced by stars which pass close to the sun. As Henderson explains, this phenomenon matched a prediction Einstein made as part of his general theory, that light would be deflected by a gravitational field. Since Einstein had predicted that this type of phenomena would take place due to space curvature caused by gravity, Eddington's discovery immediately brought worldwide acclaim to both Einstein and his theories. This led scientists all over the world to believe that the irrational ideas of relativity were perhaps correct after all. The problem is that, by this point, Because of Michelson and Morley's fateful experiment, no one was looking to the ether theory as an alternate explanation for Eddington's observations. As it turns out, the gravitational deflection of starlight that Eddington observed is also predicted in the ether model of physics, but for a different reason than that which Einstein attributes it to. Another synchronistic discovery around the same time period served to further cement the idea that Einstein's theories were correct within the public mind. The second event took place with Hubble's famous discovery of wavelength expansions or redshifts, which were observed in incoming light received from distant stars. Again, because the ether theory had been abandoned by this point, other exotic theories were proposed, and this is how scientists came to believe the idea that we live in an infinitely expanding universe. Of course, this notion doesn't make any sense at all, as no one can satisfactorily explain what, why, or how this universal expansion is taking place, or what it is expanding into. Nonetheless, this theory has since become widely accepted within the scientific community. Summarizing Hubble's expanding universe theory, Henderson writes that the astronomer E. Hubble proposed that the observed wavelength expansions, referred to as redshifts, were due to Doppler shifts caused by motions of separation between Earth and the distant object. In other words, the redshifts exist because the Earth and the distant stars are moving away from each other. Here, Henderson pauses to comment. Now, since Doppler wavelength expansions can only be produced by a source wave moving through a wave-conducting medium, this discovery should have actually disproved special relativity, which contends that there was no light-conducting medium. However, since rationality was no longer required, it was simply accepted that the assumed Doppler shifts occurred without an ether due to obscure relativistic effects that no one could adequately explain. Using Einstein's relativistic approach, an irrational equation was derived for the Doppler properties of light, which ostensibly verified that the Doppler shifts were taking place without the involvement of a medium. This equation served to strengthen the belief in relativity, ostensibly verifying the irrational concept that Doppler shifts could occur in light waves without the existence of a light-conducting medium. Henderson informs us that it was from these redshift observations that the Big Bang expanding universe theory was originally contrived. For example, to make this theory work, it is generally assumed that as much as 90% of the physical matter in the universe is invisible and is yet to be identified, a concept which defies common sense. However, because of scientists' abandonment of the ether concept and the subsequent acceptance of the restrictions imposed by Einstein's relativity on the rational understanding of gravity, that the assumption of this so-called dark matter is required. However, if we revert back to ether theory, these redshifts can be explained simply without reference to a Big Bang expanding universe model. As Henderson informs us, Doppler wavelength expansions or contractions are simply determined by the vector additions of the distances traveled by the wave crest moving through the medium, and by its source through the medium during one period of the wave. A medium must therefore be involved, since it is the vector addition of distances with respect to the medium which produces the effect. So the basic idea is that the ether is sort of a very simple way to describe this phenomena, but if you don't use the ether, if you are just biased against that explanation, you're looking for an alternate explanation, that's how they come up with this Big Bang expanding universe theory. They infer it based on the idea that they're going to reject the ether and just try to find some relativistic alternate explanation. But it doesn't make any sense. But yet it becomes this sort of ideology and belief system. One of the core beliefs of scientism, the cult of secular materialistic science is that, the universe begins with a Big Bang. But it's not a sound philosophical idea. It has nothing to do with actual science. It's a very much like a quasi-religious belief system that's been sort of artificially propped up and brought forward as a type of public myth. That's kind of the general thesis I'm arguing here. So stepping back and surveying the trajectory that modern science has gone down over the past century plus, Henderson writes that the fundamental problem with the present-day body of scientific knowledge is its failure to acknowledge the existence of a physical universal medium, originally contrived as the luminiferous ether, to account for the wave properties of light. Without doubt, he tells us the lack of acknowledgement of the existence of a universal medium remains the single greatest obstacle to the rational progress of science. Instead of a rational science based on sound Baconian principles, we've been given an irrational scientific worldview based around Einstein's relativity and other similarly nonsensical theories. As Henderson emphasizes, the concept of relativity has been an impediment to the rational progress of science for the last 100 years. Whereas it has always been assumed that the scientific process was based on sound, verified facts, systematically accumulated and woven into a tapestry of rational knowledge, such has not been the case since the inception of relativity. Overall, Henderson concludes that the greatest damage that relativity has caused in the field of science has been its influence in inhibiting the consideration of the universal medium. Einstein's special theory, which contends that a medium is not required to explain the propagation of light, and his general theory, which contends that a medium is not required to explain the phenomenon of gravity, combine to ostensibly preclude a universal medium as an essential requirement of a rational science. The situation that has resulted is one that Tesla himself aptly described when he wrote, quote, "Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation, and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality." And that's the end of that section. So that whole discussion on Einstein and relativity theory was, I did all that as a juxtaposition to the ether concept, and to show and to illustrate how the processes by which our modern science has become detached from its source foundations, which is not only in philosophy, but also in alchemy, and thereby in this ether concept. And actually, to accurately explain scientific data, you actually need the ether theory. Otherwise, you just can patch together these things that don't fit together and don't work, which is what we have today, string theory and all that crap. So these are all just, it's like a public mythology. It's not actual science. And the same thing, as I say over and over again in my channel, the same thing is true with most of the approaches to modern medicine, such as vaccines. These are not scientific, but they perpetuate through a belief system and through a breakdown in the feedback loop that science requires to course correct itself. If you break down that feedback loop, then the scientific method can't work. It can't self-correct. And that's what we have, is we have a broken down feedback system because of the need for secrecy. All right, so that's the end of that section. Let's move on and return to the topic of Nikola Tesla. This next section is called the etheric physics of Nikola Tesla. All right, the etheric physics of Nikola Tesla. As we've seen, a series of synchronistic events, helped along by a secret conspiracy of hidden scientific research institutions, came together to create the foundations of a science of physics detached from its original basis in ether theory. Summarizing once again the ether's role in scientific thought before the rise of Einstein and his relativity theory, Henderson writes that, in the latter part of the 19th century, it was believed that light consisted of waves which propagated through a medium known as the luminiferous ether, or simply the ether for short. The assumption of an ether was perfectly rational. Light was known to have wave-like properties, and by definition, waves only exist within a medium. Elaborating further on the parameters of this ether concept, Henderson writes that the ether, although it could not be physically observed, was believed to possess certain specific properties, as determined from observation of the universe. First, it had to fill all existing space. Second, it had to sustain and transmit wave motion, which constituted the phenomenon of light. And third, it had to permit the passage of material objects, such as stars and planets, without retardation. Furthermore, since the ether was assumed to fill all existing space, it was considered to be the fundamental reference frame of the universe. And it was assumed that light traveled with a constant velocity c with respect to this reference frame. In addition, it was assumed that the Earth was traveling through the ether with some unknown velocity v. We should point out that many of the greatest scientific pioneers of the 19th century based their breakthrough ideas and theories on this concept of the ether. Tesla was not the only one. For example, Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell's original theories of electromagnetism were based on the ether concept. Their work still forms the basis of modern physics, but modern scientists have chosen to selectively edit out the fact that their original ideas were formulated with the ether in mind. Tom Bearden, a 20th century inventor, engineer, and student of ether physics, pointed out that alongside the rise of Einstein's nonsensical relativity model, another problematic development emerged within modern physics, one that has also contributed in significant ways to public academia abandoning the ether concept. This was the editing by Oliver Heaviside of James Clerk Maxwell's original equations unifying the magnetic and electric fields. While Maxwell's theories were rooted in the ether, Heaviside eliminated from them certain key elements which tied them to this concept. As a result, as Joseph P. Farrell explains, the equations one learns in physics textbooks and physics courses today as being Maxwell's equations are not, in fact, Maxwell's original equations. They are edited equations. Like Einstein's work, these new edited equations lack philosophical validity. Furthermore, Bearden points out that there is not now, and there never has been, a single electrical engineering department or textbook that teaches what powers an electrical circuit. This is because, to adequately understand this topic, one must revert back to the traditional ether theory that science has abandoned. Bearden explains that what powers every electric circuit and system is the broken symmetry of a dipole, each end of which is polarized into an opposing charge, positive and negative. This allows for what he calls a fierce energy exchange with the seething vacuum, or ether. In this way, any dipole will freely extract electromagnetic energy from the vacuum and convert it into real, usable, observable electromagnetic energy, pouring out this energy continuously and indefinitely so long as the dipole remains intact. Therefore, as Bearden explains, we must accept the fact that unobservable electromagnetic mass and energy are continuously absorbed from the vacuum by the source charge, then transduced into real observable electromagnetic energy, and then re-radiated in three-dimensional space in all directions as observable electromagnetic energy, creating the associated fields and potentials reaching out across the universe. This is the way it actually works. But to understand this, you have to make reference to an underlying ether. And because modern scientists don't do this, they can't actually explain any of these phenomena. The technological implications of Bearden's explanation of energy generation is profound, because it implies that, through electromagnetism, power-generating devices can be fashioned that draw directly from the ether, and therefore don't require the input of carbon-based fuels like coal or oil. Bearden states that every charge in the universe already freely and continuously pours out electromagnetic energy in three-dimensional space in all directions without any observable energy input. Or to put it more simply, all electromagnetic devices and circuits are already powered by electromagnetic energy freely extracted from the vacuum. In other words, they are open systems. This means that the entire paradigm of closed system carbon-based energy that we've been using for the past 150 years is entirely unnecessary. But as Rockefeller, Morgan, and Edison originally discovered, this closed system approach to energy generation is highly monopolizable. Ether-based energy technologies, by contrast, are not. Because of the breakthrough technological, economic, and political implications of this ether-based open systems concept of energy, it is perhaps little wonder that we don't hear of it. Ether theory was never actually disproven, it just went classified, with an artificially propped up hodgepodge of pseudoscientific concepts like relativity put forth in its place to distract public attention away from it. Nikola Tesla, being the self-driven genius and renegade thinker that he was, never abandoned the ether concept, despite the prevailing scientific consensus at the time. Indeed, it was his grounding in ether physics that served as the basis for the many breakthrough inventions he formulated later in his life, most of which were never published or financed, their blueprints having disappeared from public view. One notable researcher into Tesla's life, William Lynn, believes that outside of Tesla's many known patented inventions, such as the alternating current transmission system, existed other still classified works which were far in advance of the published ones. It seems clear that these inventions became classified because they were based on the same ether physics model that engineers in secret government projects like the Sonora Aero Club were using to develop their technologies. Tesla once transparently stated his belief that all attempts to explain the workings of the universe without recognizing the existence of the ether and the indispensable function it plays are futile and destined to oblivion. He also stated that there is no energy in physical matter other than that received from the environment. For this reason, as Lin explains, Tesla considered his theory wholly inconsistent with the theory of relativity and with the modern theory concerning the structure of the atom and the mutual interconversion of matter and energy. Tesla continuously attacked the validity of Einstein's work, and until 2 or 3 years before his death, he ridiculed the belief that energy could be obtained from matter. Instead of relativity, Tesla promoted the idea of a dynamic luminiferous ether. In one famous quote, Tesla makes clear his ideas about the nature of this ether, writing that, quote, "Long ago, man recognized that all perceptible matter comes from a primary substance, or a tenuity beyond conception, filling all space, the akasa, or luminiferous ether, which is acted upon by the life-giving prana or creative force, calling into existence in never-ending cycles all things and phenomena." I mean, wow, that's a perfect explanation of like the spiritual cosmology concept of the esoteric philosophies, the orders. So he seems to have, I mean, maybe he was a student of these works to some degree. I can't tell. It doesn't seem likely that he was part of any kind of secret society that initiated him into these ideas. It seems that he came to these conclusions intuitively through his own inner mystical experiences as well. So continuing his quote, he writes that during the cosmic creation process, the primary substance, thrown into infinitesimal whirls of prodigious velocity, becomes gross matter. And by implication, when the force subsides, the motion ceases and matter disappears, reverting to the primary substance. Later, in a 1908 op-ed for the New York Times, Tesla elaborated on these ideas, writing that according to an adopted theory, every ponderable atom is differentiated from a tenuous fluid filling all space merely by spinning motion, as a whirl of water in a calm lake. By being set in movement, this fluid, the ether, becomes gross matter. Its movement arrested, the primary substance reverts to its normal state. It appears then possible for man, through harness energy of the medium and suitable agencies for starting and stopping either whirls, to cause matter to form and disappear. Wow. Imagine the implications of this. Based on this way of conceptualizing the basis of energy, form, and substance, Tesla developed the blueprints for exotic technologies such as free energy or over unity devices. He also developed the blueprints for wireless energy transmission systems and communication technologies. And furthermore, he had the blueprints for flying machines like the arrows or airships previously mentioned. Clearly, these same ideas were being worked on and developed in secrecy by teams of alchemy-inspired engineers who were working with this same concept of etheric energy that Tesla was basing his work off of, ether being, of course, the fifth element of alchemy. The difference was, Tesla was bringing these ideas and inventions out to the public as a lone renegade, while also explaining in transparent terms what the basis of his notions were, paving the way for others to potentially imitate and build off his work. By contrast, in research groups like the Sonora Aero Club, these same ideas were being developed under the banner of secrecy, with major financial and political players like NIMSA working behind the scenes to coordinate the development of these technologies. As we will see, once Tesla began plans to build a free wireless energy device designed to draw energy out of the ether and disperse it freely to the masses, his financial backers, notably JP Morgan, turned on him, confiscated his blueprints, classified his ideas, and left him to live out the remainder of his years in desperate poverty. Clearly, as Tesla's story shows us, as the flying airship mysteries indicate, and as the unfolding history of the 20th century also suggests, there exists within the American national security establishment a secret scientific core, which seeks to protect and keep secret its scientific ideas and technologies from outside interference. Tesla emerged as a threat to this hidden structure, and his career was destroyed as a result. This secret scientific core, in conjunction with key players in various adjacent fields like banking and industry, appeared to have conspired to classify the entire ether-based model of physics, moving it away from public consciousness and substituting in its place a modern mythic dogma incorporating Einstein's relativity, Big Bang cosmology, and other nonsensical theories guaranteed to lead nowhere. These hollow substitutes have become the basis of a tightly controlled body of public science, with an entirely different paradigm being pursued in secret by the descendants of groups like the Sonora Aero Club. In short, beginning around the time of Tesla, we find a two-track system of physics and technology being developed. One secret, based on ether physics, the other public, based on relativistic models. And that's the situation we find ourselves in to this day. All right, that's the end of that section. So I have one more to go in this article. But once more, that was called The Etheric Physics of Nikola Tesla. And this last section is called Nikola Tesla's Ill-Fated Battle with J.B. Morgan. And we'll be going into some of the details that we first hinted at about this archetypal struggle, this archetypal disagreement between these two camps. And so that's coming next. All right, this last section, once again, called Nikola Tesla's Ill-Fated Battle with J.P. Morgan. Earlier, I stated that the trajectory of Nikola Tesla's career seems to have been karmically intertwined with larger events playing out within collective society. To recap, the ether model of physics he utilized soon disappeared from public view, and his many later breakthrough inventions became locked down and classified. What happened to him also seems to have happened to others. All over, the fix was in, and it seems that a policy of absolute secrecy concerning the scientific concepts he engaged in had been enacted at the level of national security. Here, Tesla comes to symbolize the natural trajectory of scientific development that should have taken place, had outside interference not moved in and jammed up its progress, blocking it from moving along the lines that Francis Bacon had originally laid out for it hundreds of years before. Instead, a two-track model of science emerged, one public, one classified. The public version became grounded in an unphilosophical, nonsensical, materialistic, closed system approach, while the private classified version was based on a rational, alchemical, ether-based, open system concept. In Tesla's story, the famous financier J.P. Morgan plays the part of the archetypal adversary, who, learning of Tesla's plans for world wireless, moved to shut down his project and confiscate his blueprints. In this way, Morgan plays the part of the deep state. In my view, I don't believe that Morgan acted on his own in doing this. More likely, he was acting on the advice of certain unknown advisors working on behalf of the newly emerging national security state. They sought to protect their monopoly over ether-based scientific research and technology development, and needed Tesla shut down to make this possible. Acting on their advice, Morgan moved in and made this obfuscation possible. But I doubt Morgan himself was really read into the situation or understood exactly why, other than to see that Tesla's free energy device represented an existential threat to the centralized closed system model he was attempting to establish with Edison. It seems that the hidden deep state entity acting behind Morgan wanted to make not only Tesla's breakthrough technology secret, but also the entire paradigm of ether physics he was using, making it classified and closed off to public awareness. Given my above-mentioned theory that Tesla's fate was intertwined with greater motions taking place within society as a whole during this time period, we can infer that, by learning more about what happened to Tesla, important insights can be gleaned about what was taking place behind the scenes within the deep state. As we mentioned, Tesla seems to have formulated his breakthrough ideas on his own as a lone genius and maverick. Therefore, when his research became locked down and frustrated, it tells us something about the strategic mind state of the powers that be. In addition, the trajectory of Tesla's research gives us valuable insight into the types of scientific ideas that were likely being developed within the hidden scientific research institutions that we know were developing technologies like the flying airships. To build this case, let's begin by investigating Tesla's own version of events about how he came to invent his world wireless technology, the one he was working to build with Morgan's money. Tesla writes that his great intuitive realization about the nature of the ether and how it could be harnessed into a wireless energy transmission technology came during the years 1893 to 1894. He states that during this period, which is one of intense concentration, I was fortunate enough to make two far-reaching discoveries. The first was a dynamic theory of gravity, which I have worked out in all its details and hope to give to the world very soon. It explains the causes of this force and the motions of heavenly bodies under its influence so satisfactorily that it will put an end to idle speculation and false conceptions, as that of curved space. Here, he is clearly taking a shot at Einstein. He then takes another by remarking how his theory is rooted in the ether concept, and not in Einstein's relativistic concepts. He states that only the existence of a field of force can account for the motions of the bodies as observed, and its assumption dispenses with space curvature. All literature on this subject is futile and destined to oblivion. So are all attempts to explain the workings of the universe without recognizing the existence of the ether and the indispensable function it plays in the phenomena. Tesla then writes that during this critical period he made a second discovery that was also of the greatest importance. This was that there is no energy in matter other than that received from the environment or ether. Here, Tesla is putting forth the same idea that we earlier quoted Thomas Bearden in explaining, that in any electrical current or conductor, it is not so much the power source that produces the power, but rather that such a source, along with the parameters of the circuit itself, is an open system transfusing power from the medium. And that is actually a quote from Joseph Farrell, who was describing there Thomas Bearden's research. So in this way, as Joseph Farrell explains, Tesla's view of the ether shows his thinking to be far from the inert and static ether of 19th century physicists. As this passage makes clear, Tesla envisioned it as a transmutative ether. Therefore, unlike most physicists and engineers of his time, he appears to have held the view that this ether had fluid-like properties, i.e. that it had the ability to be compressed or rarefied, that is, to be stressed. This is important to understand in order to grasp the basics of the breakthrough energy system that Tesla was attempting to design using Morgan's money. Tesla was attempting, as he states in his own words, to transmit power in unlimited amounts to any terrestrial distance and almost without any loss. The primary antenna he was planning to use to create this system came from the Earth itself, leveraging its natural electromagnetic properties. Tesla's goals for his technology went beyond just energy generation. He also hoped to use it to create a type of super internet. In his own words, he explains how he planned to use his wireless system as a means for intelligence transmission, which the name of world telegraphy has been suggested, easily realizable. Thus, the entire Earth will be converted into a huge brain, as it were, capable of response in every one of its parts. Joseph P. Farrell comments that this would create a new dynamic type of internet, one beyond anything currently imaginable, for it has no need of wires, gateway computers, or satellites in order to function. In Tesla's grand vision, the Earth itself fulfills these functions. At the time he was seeking financing for this system, Tesla was marketing it as a radio and telephone device. The full implications of it he would publicly reveal only later on, once his funding from Morgan had been withdrawn and his work confiscated. Tesla first conceived of his plan for world wireless while working in Colorado Springs. Here, he performed the initial experiments to test the idea. Convinced it would work, he returned to New York and sought the backing of investors in order to put the idea into commercial testing. As Farrell explains, this is where Tesla's difficulties began, and where suppression of the physics and engineering his system represented was clearly evident. In his book Babylon's Banksters, Farrell tells the story of what happened. So this is all quoting Farrell now. Tesla, as is well known, approached the American international banker J.P. Morgan for a loan. After detailing his plan for a global system of wireless telegraphy, even proposing to send the human voice and actual pictures by means of it in a kind of terrestrial radio and television, Morgan advanced Tesla the funds. What Tesla did not reveal to Morgan at this juncture was that he intended to transmit electrical power itself by this means, making even his own stupendously successful system of alternating current, the system now in use worldwide, obsolete. With Morgan's funds in place, Tesla chose a place on Long Island, purchased land, built a power plant, and a large tower. He called the place and the project Wardenclyffe. In another fateful synchronicity, one that would have unfortunate consequences for Tesla and his plans, the Italian physicist and engineer G. Marconi, using Tesla's own devices and inventions to boot, beat him to the punch by transmitting the first transatlantic radio signal, using standard radio circuit arrangements and Hertzian jump rope electromagnetic waves, while Tesla's project was still under construction. Faced with cheaper competition in a deceptively simpler but much less flexible system, Morgan threatened to pull the financial plug on Tesla's scheme. It was then Faced with the demise of his project, that Tesla revealed his true intentions to Morgan. He planned to beam power itself through the earth to any point on the globe. With this revelation, Morgan did pull the plug, and Tesla's grand project came to an end and has never since been publicly revived. Here we come to an important question, one that will take one or more future articles to fully unpack. In suppressing Tesla's inventions, was Morgan acting alone, concerned only with his ability to capitalize on a closed system model of electrical power generation like that which Edison was working to pioneer, and which since has become the standard, now being in use everywhere around the world? Likewise, when Morgan worked to found important deep state policymaking institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations, was he also acting alone, motivated only by a desire for himself and his fellow oligarchs to rise victorious over their European counterparts, establishing an American economic imperium in the process? And further, when he worked behind the scenes to establish the Federal Reserve System, was this merely a ploy to consolidate and enhance the power and wealth of himself and his fellow bankers, with no other motivation present? As we'll be further exploring in future articles, I do not believe he was acting alone. In fact, I believe that, to a degree he himself was probably not even aware of, his own greed and desire to consolidate power and control were leveraged as assets by a deeper hidden deep state entity. By means of the rapacious greed of Wall Street's banking oligarchy, this hidden hand was able to accomplish something necessary to its own goals, the consolidation and cartelization of the West's major industries and financial institutions. This new consolidated structure would allow them, through the oligarchy, to establish a centralized system of economic, political, scientific, and technological control, something of vital necessity for the future development of their secret research projects. Clearly, whatever secret and hidden research groups and technological development organizations that existed during the 19th century were set to benefit immensely from the consolidation and privatization of America's financial, economic, and industrial systems. The question is, was it merely a coincidence that these factors came together to support their plans and goals? In my view, Morgan, Rockefeller, and other powerful oligarchs of the period were not acting as completely autonomous free agents. Rather, they appear to have been assets or marks, as it's sometimes called, of a deeper, invisible national security apparatus that was likely unknown even to them. It seems that this deeper structure was using the oligarchs as a means to accomplish certain necessary and desired ends. By accomplishing these ends through the instrument of oligarchs like the Morgans and Rockefellers, these deeper hidden entities could mask their own secret existence, thereby protecting the breakthrough scientific concepts and technologies they were developing, keeping them secret. The desire of the West's capitalist oligarchs to consolidate their control over the global financial system and the major industries of the West, bringing it from a free market to a centrally controlled cartel structure, just happened to be a key strategic necessity for the secret scientific research groups who were working on things like anti-gravity flying machines. These groups wanted, or needed, for national security purposes, for this technology to be kept secret, private, and under centralized control. Thus, they needed a situation where they could obtain private off-the-books funding for their research while eliminating any source of competition, bringing the whole thing under one centralized umbrella structure. The self-interested, greed-driven machinations of the Wall Street capitalists provided a perfect cover for this. This oligarchy therefore became natural allies or assets for the national security state to leverage. By advising and influencing the long-range planning and thinking of capitalist oligarchs like Morgan and Rockefeller, these secret scientific societies, in coordination with the national security state, could incrementally guide their desired world system into place, all the while masking their activities in such a way that no one even knows that they exist. In my eyes, the careers of Morgan and Rockefeller cannot be adequately explained without reference to the idea that behind each existed a hidden hand, maneuvering each to pursue certain long-range geopolitical outcomes that were necessary for the maintenance of this two-tiered system of science and technology to continue. This is a theory we will continue to develop over the course of future articles. As I hope you can now see, it forms the basis of my method for reframing the 20th century, discussed in this article's introductory section. To quickly revisit the reframing approach laid out in the beginning of this article, I presented the idea that the story of modern civilization is the outcome of 4 interwoven tiers or levels of social activity, which synthesize together to explain the history of the 20th century. At the base level of this social model is situated the outer populace and the formal institutions of government that they interface with. Behind this base level is the capitalist oligarchy, which has infested the outer state with its greedy and materialistic ideologies, taking control of its financial and economic systems and co-opting its democratic political institutions in the process. Now, having gone through all the material presented in this article, it should be clear that, existing as a third level, there exists a secret scientific research and technological development apparatus. This forms a hidden inner tier to the shadow government or deep state concept that the oligarchs discussed in our first 4 articles helped maneuver into place since the time of the nation's founding. The idea here is that the capitalist oligarchy operates only on a lower level of the deep state, while the secret scientific and technological research institutions we've been discussing in this article exist together on a higher and deeper plane of the shadow government, unseen and unknown by the lower level. And then finally, behind these 3 levels is a 4th tier. I haven't touched too much on this 4th level in this article, but have in other articles and chapters of this book. It represents the modern scientific age incarnation of the mystery schools, which came over to this country at the point of its initial inception through the work of Francis Bacon and his Rosicrucian Society. Keeping this 4-tiered model of social organization in mind, we are next going to be delving into certain mostly unknown and overlooked aspects of World War II, ones that come together to further support this theory that there exists at a very deep level within the deep state, a secret classified scientific research institution. In this manner, we'll be exploring World War II as a type of case study to see if it fits the sociological and historical model we've been developing in this article. As you might by now expect, it does fit. Stay tuned to learn how. As you might by now expect, it does fit. But stay tuned to learn how, because that'll be the topic that we're going to go into in this next article. So that is the end of this section and the end of the article. It was an epic one, but it was on this this emergence of a secret scientific tradition. And for students of esoteric philosophy, you'll notice that what is being fashioned here is really the replication of a archetype, an old archetype, which is the division of esoteric and exoteric knowledge. So now in this new scientific age, we have this division of esoteric and exoteric taking place within the field of science itself. So there's 2 types of knowledge. There's like an esoteric scientific knowledge based on the ether, and then there's an exoteric version that factors out the ether and instead situates various kind of falsely engineered theories like Einstein's relativity theory and other various other models that don't fit together. So that's why scientists haven't been able to find a unified model of physics, and why really all the scientific disciplines that we study today are all kept separate from each other. Is because this non-holistic version of science is a type of public myth that masks the existence of a deeper level, and who can look at the modern UFO revelations of the government, who are saying that the Navy and stuff are saying that we didn't build them, but we're acknowledging that they exist. Who can really explain that situation other than you have 2 options. You can either revert to this kind of theory that I'm developing here in this article, or you can just explain the whole thing away and shut down your thinking by just being like, oh, it's aliens. We don't need to factor any of this, it's aliens and we can't understand it because we're just mere mortal humans. But, in my opinion, that the whole alien thing, not to say that there's nothing to like other spiritual, beings in the universe. I'm not saying that there aren't, but that as an explanation for this UFO phenomena is absurd, because look at this whole story we're putting together that goes back to the 1800s that talks about the development of anti-gravity machines, as far back as 1850 with prototypes and diagrams shared. And then there's 1,500 articles in the 1890s that came out talking about these flying airships. And then those just disappear like all of a sudden and you never see them again at the same, like right around the same time that Tesla's coming out with his ideas, and then boom, his ideas disappear and you never hear from them again. Well, we're going to be talking in subsequent articles about how, there's more evidence that has since come out in the course of the 20th century, particularly around the time of World War II and in the decade or two after, where again you hear about anti-gravity research being done on secret government level, and then boom, that all disappears. So this is clearly a major signal here that there is some terrestrial explanation that we have to understand if we're really going to obtain the lesson that the UFO can teach us. So in this way, the UFO is almost like a mandala that you can use to unravel the mysteries of our own, social organization, our own, the various levels of social organization that go into informing how society actually works. Most people think only the outer level exists, but I'm saying there's actually 3 other levels behind the outer level. There's the oligarchy, there's this secret research part, and then there's also the esoteric orders, like the Rosicrucian order of Francis Bacon. So that's 3 other levels behind the outer society that most people think is the only truth. So as a last note, I want to point out to those who have been following the channel, for the past year, for this whole book project, if you remember back into my series on mandalas, the last article and episode of that series, which is called World Civilization as a Mandala, I go over the idea of the old caste system and how there's 4 levels of the old caste system, and that these were organized according to the principles of alchemy, meaning the 4 elements. So there was air, water, fire, and there was earth, water, fire, and air. Well, guess what this model of reframing the 20th century is based on? These 4 levels. So we have earth is the outer level, the public sort of concept. And this economically corresponds to labor. Then you go 1 level deeper. That's where you have in that, in the 4-level caste system, you have next up the aristocracy, and also the sort of public influencers, cultural leaders. And so those are the people who become leveraged, the oligarchy, to create this second level of oligarchy. So that exists behind the public state, which is supposedly a democracy. All right, so that's the water level. Now, fire was anciently called the warrior caste, and that really represents the state, who are the protectors of this 4th level, which is the Brahmin caste, which are the the philosophers and sages. So we have this deep state entity as this 3rd level corresponding to fire, and then air is representing the intellect and the masters of intellect, and those are these sort of philosopher sages. And in this modern version, these would be like the sort of master alchemists who are secretly, not only behind the research projects, but also running the whole system as an initiatory program, because their ultimate goal is the evolution of the human soul, not the development of technology. So the technology becomes a means to an end to facilitate the evolutionary development of human civilization in a certain direction. So those 4 levels of the caste system are now, in my analysis of the 20th century, the 4 tiers that we need to consider and then synthesize together to understand why what happened. And then conversely, to this day, these 4 levels still remain. So as we're trying to understand, modern world events, and how, as we try to diagnose modern situation, the modern problems of the world, the state of the world, we need to factor in this dynamic situation with these 4 levels integrating together and playing off one another. And so furthermore, when we think about how we design a future world system that can solve the problems that we have, so after we've diagnosed it, how do we solve the problem? We need to also integrate these 4 levels, because all 4, it's an archetype that will always exist. The human soul collectively will manifest in these 4 levels. And in each level, human souls will incarnate to fulfill roles within each level according to their own needs and sort of soul plan and karmic destiny. So as you think about designing a future world civilization, you need to factor in these 4 levels and give space for each to work and operate. And the idea, whereas now these are all compartmentalized from each other and separated, in the future, the goal is to create a holistic system where all 4 work in an integrated fashion. That's the archetype. That's the ideal. And the idea is that originally, in like the oldest days, society was run in this fashion where all 4 worked together, and everybody knew that they worked together. Everybody knew there was a caste system with this order, and they knew why and the reasons for it. And when I say caste system, I don't mean that it has to be like the old caste system where you were born into a role and you couldn't leave, and you were defined by what position you were born into. I'm just saying, like, the organization of society, the organization of the human psyche, of the collective body of civilization, that will always be these 4 levels. And so we can find a dynamic way and a non-autocratic way to run a system that has 4 levels. But the point is, we need to find a way to take out the barriers that separate them, and to sort of let light shine on the whole system, and then we can, work constructively with it and build a better world that meets, the humanity's needs at the level of the archetype. So if we can try to establish the archetype of human civilization, what it should be and where it's going to and what it needs to be, we need to factor in this kind of dynamic assessment. So that's my position anyway. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. Stay tuned for the next article. It's going to be, as I mentioned there at the end, it's going to be on World War II. And we're going to be revisiting these same themes and then applying it to that topic of study. So hopefully it'll be revealing some very interesting things about the 20th century that we just started to develop now in this article. So thank you very much for listening, to everybody who's still here with me at the end of this episode. I know it was a long one, but thank you again, and God bless.